My name is Lawrence Lessig, and I'm the director of the center and a professor here at the law school. In 2 weeks, we will be welcoming Barbara Herman, who teaches in the philosophy department and the law school at UCLA. But tonight, it's my great pleasure to be able to welcome back to the law school Congressman Jim Cooper. That's a secret that he doesn't repeat often down in the district. Congressman Cooper is from Tennessee's 5th Congressional District. He's here to deliver a lecture titled Fixing Congress. Congressman Cooper graduated from this law school in 1980. Before that, he had received a degree from Oxford in politics and economics, and before that, a BA in history and economics from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. In 1982, at the age of 28, he was elected to a version of the district in Tennessee that Al Gore had represented before he went to the United States Senate. And in 1994, after Al Gore became vice president, Cooper ran for the United States Senate. But as you might remember, or you might have read if you studied history, for those of you not old enough to remember, 1994 was not a fantastic year for Democrats. Indeed, in Tennessee, the Republicans swept the Senate, both seats, and the governorship, and was the majority party in the congressional delegation for only the second time since Reconstruction. So that brought Jim back to Nashville, where he ran a private business and then taught at Vanderbilt's Business School. But in 2002, he returned, this time in the 5th Congressional District as a Blue Dog Democrat, and has been reelected comfortably each time since, including in this most recent replay of 1994, one of the few very successful Blue Dog Democrats to come back to Congress. Now, he's listed as the 65th most senior member of Congress, but that's actually a bit misleading, because if you base his seniority on the basis of when he first went to Congress, all but 22 members of Congress have seen Congress with the perspective that he has seen. And indeed, he's the youngest of that list of 23 by far, so he's got a better memory of that perspective of Congress than the rest of them. That experience gives him the perspective on Congress that I think is essential to understand the institution, understand its weaknesses, and understand how to restore a sense of its potential. It was for that reason Elena Kagan first introduced me to Jim Cooper when I started pestering her about these issues of how to make Congress work again. And since then, he has been my most important teacher, spending many hours with me, educating me about the institution and its ideals and its potential. And I'm therefore very happy that he's accepted my invitation to come share with us his thoughts about how to make this institution work or work better. And I'm also happy tonight to be able to announce that another side to this question, fixing Congress, will be offered by a Republican on March 24th, a friend of Jim Cooper, Buddy Roemer, who will come and deliver his view on the same question to produce a brace of perspectives that I hope this community can join and learn from. So please join with me in welcoming back to Harvard once again Congressman Jim Cooper.
Okay. Thank you so much, Larry. I'm honored to be back on campus, and you paid me one of the highest compliments I could ever receive. To be a teacher for you is indeed a privilege. Since all politics is local, let me single out one person in this room, the former mayor of Nashville, Tennessee, Bill Purcell. We're glad that you're at Harvard, at least on a temporary basis, but we want you back home. Former Senator Howard Baker once said that there are 3 things he could not possibly understand: the Holy Ghost, the Middle East, and the House of Representatives. No one probably understands the House fully, but most people do think that it's broken. Badly broken. As Larry said, I've been in Congress off and on for almost 30 years. I too have seen the decline, but it's not the decline that worries me. What worries me is that we, as the world's only superpower, cannot afford to break down now. And worse, it worries me that as an aging superpower, we might be losing some of our capacity for self-renewal. Our greatest strength has always been our ability to bounce back in time. Our greatest strength is resilience. As Winston Churchill once said, America can always be counted on to do the right thing after she has exhausted all the alternatives. You are about to hear a very fundamental critique of Congress. I focus on the House much more than the Senate, although I acknowledge the need for filibuster reform in the Senate is urgent. Forgive me for speaking somewhat in topic sentences due to time constraints, but there's a lot of ground to cover. It's a grim diagnosis, but I believe it's a lot better for the patient to hear the news early rather than late. Don't get too depressed. There's still time for a cure. Not much time, but enough. First, I see a Congress that is willfully blind to most of our nation's major problems. For example, the true national debt is many times larger than published numbers, more like $50 trillion than $15 trillion. But Congress has exempted itself from normal accounting rules, and I want to single out Howell Jackson in particular for being a rare leader in pointing out this problem, because not even the Wall Street Journal uses the right numbers on a frequent basis. These are the accrual numbers, and no interest group in America supports this real accrual accounting for America. So Congress sleeps. Not even the President's Fiscal Commission could wake us. Second, the core business of federal government today is insurance. Huge programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the VA, and government subsidies for private health insurance. But people systematically refuse to understand these programs. It's common to hear the phrase, "I want to keep the government's hands off my Medicare." These insurance programs are so large that they dwarf essential government functions like national defense and homeland security. They completely overshadow all domestic spending, things like interstate highways, national parks, research spending, agriculture. Yet despite the dominance of insurance in government, there is no congressional committee on insurance, no focused expertise on insurance products. Tax expenditures are another huge but overlooked area. They dwarf appropriations, but Congress rarely even holds hearings on this annual $1.3 trillion drain on our nation's revenues. Never has America been in greater need of tax reform. Third, the biggest disconnect in politics today is the fact that these vital entitlement programs are not, as politicians claim, sacred commitments, vested benefits, or even government promises. What they are scheduled benefits that we know today we do not know how to fund. Until we fix this disconnect, these vital programs are in jeopardy. When this realization sinks in, it could make the Tea Party movement look like a picnic. The sooner we act on these programs to stabilize them, the more likely we can save them. It will be painful, but we should be thankful that we still have time. Wall Street credit rating agencies like Moody's and Standard & Poor's give us 1 or 2 more years. Fourth, Congress often refuses to use the right tools to solve problems. In fact, most members of Congress really don't know what's in our toolbox. Year-round campaigning distracts us from the craft of legislating. A screwdriver problem obviously needs a screwdriver solution, but oftentimes we'll use a wrench. And we choose wrenches because they're popular that year. The classic example is tax credits. These are golden on the stump, but as MIT economist John Gruber has shown, most healthcare tax credits at least waste 2 out of every $3. I sometimes wish that we had competency testing for Congress, or at least some sort of apprenticeship program. Finally, Congress has grown spoiled because modern presidents have refused to veto much legislation. For most of his administration, George W. Bush vetoed fewer bills than any president since Thomas Jefferson. Every president since Richard Nixon has had budget rescission power and used it hundreds of times, except for our last two presidents. President Obama, in his first speech to Congress 2 years ago, called for an end to earmarking, and the next day his Democratic Congress gave him 8,500 earmarks, and he did nothing about it. I was thankful this week in the State of the Union message when he said that he would veto future earmarks, but Congress simply will not believe him until he fights back. So how did Congress get this bad? And why didn't you know more about it? When Cambridge's own Tip O'Neill was Speaker of the House, just over 20 years ago, Congress was very different than it is today. Imperfect, to be sure, but functional. Tip O'Neill believed that he was Speaker of the whole House. He did not want Democrats to win every vote. He wanted the House of Representatives to work its will. He criticized President Reagan during the day and drank beer with him at night. He was proud of powerful committee chairmen like Danny Rostenkowski of Illinois, of Ways and Means. On major issues, members then were expected to vote their conscience and their district. It was the job of the eloquent majority leader, Jim Wright, to corral enough Democratic votes, and the job of the gentlemanly minority leader, Bob Michel, to defeat those majorities. People could disagree without being disagreeable. You were considered a party loyalist if you supported your party's position 70 or 80% of the time. Members knew exactly what they were voting on because of an elite group of staffers called the Democratic Study Group that wrote authoritative pro-con memos before every vote. Republican members trusted the Democratic Study Group so much that they subscribed to its services. In the O'Neill era, members worked 4 or 5 days a week in Washington, D.C., where their families usually lived. Members knew each other's names and often spouses and children. A few members did belong to what Tip called the Tuesday-Thursday Club, where members worked a short week in Washington but shirked their legislative duties. Casework, however, is also a part of the legislative portfolio, and members could do that ably back home. On the House floor, and this is very important, so-called King of the Hill rules for debate were very common. Under such rules, members are allowed to choose among competing solutions to different national problems. The solution with the most votes won, even if a previous proposal had already received a majority of votes. King of the Hill rules allowed limited legislative freedom, but it made it much harder to predict how members would vote. Back then, you never contributed to your colleagues' campaigns except in emergency. In fact, it was considered an insult to give a colleague a contribution, almost like handing them a tip. Campaigns could cost as much as several $100,000, but only if the race were hotly contested. Likewise, political parties did not dare charge you dues. It was their job to help you. The chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee worked in a modest room near the Page Dormitory, blocks from the Capitol. Chairing the DCCC was considered a chore. Well, Congress has deteriorated badly since the O'Neill era. When Newt Gingrich became Speaker in 1995, he centralized power in the Speaker's office and politicized it. He effectively merged the Speaker's office with the Majority Leader's office and the Whip's office. Committee chairmen were emasculated. Gingrich wanted Republicans to win every vote. He waged total war on the Clinton White House, even temporarily shutting down government in an effort to get his way. The next speaker, Dennis Hastert, continued Gingrich's approach when he admitted that he really only listened to Republicans, as he called it, the majority of the majority. Congress polarized rapidly, with party unity scores rapidly climbing to 95% plus levels. Objective information sources like the Democratic Study Group were banned. Members were force-fed talking points so that everybody could stay on message. Members were told exactly how to vote. Gingrich reportedly had said at the time that the first step in a revolution is to silence the television stations. King of the Hill voting was ended. What we had instead were partisan steamroller votes, with one vote, yes or no, at the end of a long debate. No coherent alternatives were allowed to be considered, only the approval of party doctrine. Instead of limited legislative freedom, members could choose between being a team player or a traitor. Gingrich ordered freshman Republicans not to move their homes to Washington so that they could campaign full-time back home. Soon everyone belonged to the Tuesday-Thursday club that Tip O'Neill had criticized as lazy. Members quickly became strangers to each other, making it easier for them to fight. The cost of campaigns soon escalated into the millions. Some members soon were spending almost all day and into the night on call time, dialing for dollars in party call centers just off campus. Parties started requiring that their members pay dues, minimum levels of $100,000, but it could escalate up to $1 million. These dues had to be paid just so that you could remain in good standing. Colleagues began demanding contributions of each other, sometimes just to pay the party dues. Instead of legislation and casework, the old job of Congress, the new job became telemarketing, fundraising, and earmarking. The heads of the party campaign committees soon had their picks of offices in the Capitol itself because they're being groomed for party leadership. When Democrats took back control of Congress in 2007, Democratic leaders, sadly, tragically, did not even try to return to the policies of Tip O'Neill. We blew our chance to go back to the future. Instead, Democrats quietly adopted most of the bad habits of Gingrich and Hastert and of the notorious Tom DeLay. Few Democrats even remained who could remember the O'Neill era. Essentially, we forgot all about Brigadoon and we settled for Lord of the Flies. Some people said it was impossible to go back because times had changed. Fox and MSNBC had inflamed partisanship. Social media had popularized non-fact-based reality. The truth, however, is that the Gingrich-Hastert-DeLay model works if you're only interested in controlling Congress. No speaker wants to yield to stubborn committee chairmen or listen to opinionated rank-and-file members. It's better to keep them both in the dark in order to quell dissent. It's also easier on backbenchers themselves if they can just follow the party line without thinking. This quasi-parliamentary system is certainly efficient. What's lost are the hallmarks of Congress: open debate, independent decision-making, putting the interests of the nation first. It will be interesting to see if Speaker Boehner follows the parliamentary or the congressional model, or if he appreciates the difference. Today, members of the newly elected 112th Congress of the United States of America were just sworn in 3 weeks ago. 2 members missed the swearing in while attending a fundraiser. The first floor action was reading the Constitution aloud. The first weekend after the oath, of course, as everyone in the world knows, a beloved colleague was nearly assassinated. Since then, both parties have tried to behave more civilly, distributed committee assignments, voted on repealing health reform, held planning retreats, and sat together at the State of the Union. The big vote that everyone is dreading right now is the upcoming vote on raising the debt ceiling. We don't know if Republicans will risk ruining America's credit in order to force spending cuts, or whether Democrats will join them in that gigantic game of chicken. Aside from our own personal safety after Tucson, most members are preoccupied with 2 issues: redistricting and fundraising. The important issues of the day, the deficit, health care, military spending, are largely secondary. Freshman members are feeling pinched because of the high Washington rents and because their new colleagues prepaying their party dues, sometimes years in advance. By coincidence, many of these eager beavers got excellent committee assignments. Running for Congress today is really 3 campaigns for money. Normal campaign fundraising, raising money to pay your party dues, and now with the Citizens United decision, appealing to Citizens United donors to help with both races. The media do a much better job of reporting on how you get into Congress than how you get on top of Congress. But Citizens United could well be the determining factor. Many members are inherently panicked about their district disappearing in just a few months. They love their district. An old Tennessee legislator once said, "There are 2 things you don't mess with: my wife and my district," and not necessarily in that order. Every decade, however, the Constitution requires that every member of Congress represent the same number of people, about 700,000. Some states are losing seats, some are gaining, most are staying the same. Let's be honest, Democrats and Republicans love gerrymandering. I represent one of only 91 politically balanced districts in America out of 435, and both political parties think that 91 is entirely too many. Each party is working hard to create fewer competitive seats for itself and for the other party as well. How convenient. Computer technology helps them etch tiny lines on large maps that help them divide neighborhoods, houses, and even, in theory, double beds in order to find partisan majorities. They're able to do this because politicians know a whole lot about your voting habits. The secret ballot is almost gone, and because of that, you may well need a GPS device to find out who your next representative is. Today, both Democrats and Republicans are trying to hide the fact that a secret election is already well underway. It will be over this spring. We only have a few weeks to reform it. It's not only a secret election, but a reverse election, because regular voters don't get a chance to vote, only the politicians. You don't choose them, they choose you. In most states, the public is excluded from participating in their state legislatures' deliberations on redistricting, and the secret election is remarkably enduring. It will basically control the outcome of many congressional races for at least a decade, if not for generations. Gerrymandering, of course, fosters extremism, both on the left and on the right, because it's a lot easier to get elected in highly Democratic or highly Republican districts. Once elected, extremists only have to worry about future primaries, not general elections. Because relatively few centrist and independent voters vote in primaries at all. Newly elected extremists are vulnerable really only to someone more extreme. States with party registration laws have even successfully outlawed participation in primary elections by independents and opposition party members. So with a firm grip on their district and no worries at all about alienating someone else in the other party, oftentimes the loudest voices in Congress are the extremists. This week I filed a bill, H.R. 419, with 19 co-sponsors in an effort to put some sunlight in the redistricting process, to allow the public some participation a month or 2 before the redistricting map becomes final. This is our last chance to solve the redistricting problem. Regarding Citizens United, mixing money and politics has always been awkward. Everyone knows, for example, that professional athletes are not allowed to accept money to throw a game, but it's perfectly legal in politics. Massachusetts Congressman Barney Frank is famous for saying that the current election law assumes that every congressman every time demonstrates perfect ingratitude. That's like saying that the current law floods the system with money and expects every congressman to stay dry. Good luck with that theory. Last year, the average member of Congress had to raise about $1.6 million for a job whose salary only pays 1/10 as much. The top 10 congressional races raised over $8.5 million each. The top 10 Senate races over $36 million each. A new member's lapel pin is probably the most expensive piece of jewelry in the world. Some campaigns raised all that money themselves. Others were flooded by last-minute, allegedly independent money from outside. In the final weeks of the campaign, television ads that suddenly appeared, kind of like the cavalry in an old Western movie, arriving just in the nick of time. The Supreme Court Citizens United decision commissioned those cavalries last year, allowing corporations to campaign for the first time in our history. Already, these new troops have boosted election spending by $300 million. And this is only the beginning, because the sky is the limit once these political mercenaries are allowed. My objections to Citizens United are the following. One, allowing corporations, which are artificial persons under the law, to have free speech rights puts regular citizens, ordinary American human beings, at a disadvantage. A better name for Citizens United is Corporations Supreme. The court should stop emancipating these artificial persons, these business robots. This year, the court is even considering giving corporations privacy and due process rights. What's next? Voting rights for corporations and unions. Two, the court kept the century-old law that made a felony of any corporate contribution directly to a federal candidate. But the court, by a slender 5-4 majority, suddenly turned indirect expenditures, independent expenditures, everything around the felony, into a celebration of free speech. This is like allowing college students to sleep in the same bed and pretending they won't have sex. Everyone, except 5 justices of the court, knows how technical and ridiculous that distinction is. You don't need to contact a campaign to find out what it needs, especially in the final days of a campaign. Hardly anyone reads the taglines in these commercials on television. What people do notice is the quality of the ad. And Citizens United donors can afford the best. Almost all ads today, sadly, are negative, but independent expenditure ads can be especially cruel. Meanwhile, the favored candidate that's benefiting from this publicity can pretend they had nothing to do with the attacks. They wash their hands of the matter. 3, Citizens United has the potential of multiplying the money involved in American politics. No matter how expensive you think campaigns are today, they look cheap to corporate America. Many corporations spend many more times than this advertising diapers, colas, potato chips, you name it, oftentimes with less return on their investment. A cleverly spent $1 million in politics can sometimes buy $1 billion in tax breaks or government spending. In fact, that seems to be the going ratio these days. 4, Citizens United allows attacks by largely unknown groups with hidden sponsors. In other words, you may never know if that Citizens United cavalry saved you, or whether it was Native Americans, guerrilla warriors, snipers, aliens. Citizens United doesn't fit any script that you're familiar with or could imagine. Don't count on the Federal Election Commission forcing timely disclosure. It's notoriously flat-footed, timid, and lenient. Already half of Citizens United spending is anonymous, a percentage that's only likely to grow. Finally, Citizens United could reduce the role of Washington lobbyists. Why use a middleman if you can buy direct? This may sound like a good idea, but remember, for all the criticism of K Street, things could be worse. Today's lobbyists are relatively identifiable. They spend a relatively small amount of money, millions and not billions, and they're often less selfish than their bosses realize. I'm not saying that lobbyists advocate good government, but sometimes they do advocate pretty good government. In a Citizens United world, on the other hand, stateless ad agencies could beam down by satellite, cable, or broadcast cruel messages without ever talking to a voter or an elected official. Big Brother actually makes lobbyists look a little better. Ironically, the cure for Citizens United may well be the corporations themselves. This would be a welcome reprieve because otherwise we must either amend the Constitution or change justices, both very difficult tasks. I doubt that most large corporations wanted the new freedom that the court gave them. But will they be able to resist the temptation of using it? For a few years at least, I think most companies will be unfamiliar and uncomfortable with electioneering. Meanwhile, a few corporate fanatics could damage the image of Citizens United, causing a backlash against the court's decision. Which will come first? Corporations learning how to campaign, or business retaliation against outlaw firms? We can only hope it's the latter. In conclusion, the trouble with Congress today is that you get what you pay for, and we're paying for the wrong things. Taxpayers today hire mediocre talent, candidates who think that their job is to duck fundamental issues in order to get elected and reelected. Fixed salaries do more to perpetuate this terrible status quo than most people realize. Today, it's almost unthinkable to suggest paying Congress for results. Real leadership, however, means expanding the scope of discussion and then making it happen. Members are accustomed to blaming others for failure. In fact, they're so good at the blame game, they excel at it. The first objections to merit pay will likely come from congressmen themselves. They're also afraid of making less money than other colleagues. It's precisely this fear, however, that motivates people to behave better. Why not pay members of Congress for performance? Surely there's a way to measure and reward quality legislation. Universities and think tanks could help us devise a system. Many other professions, after all, teachers, CEOs, physicians, have been facing such pressures for years. Why not Congress? Here's a thought experiment. What if Congress were paid on commission to cut spending or to repeal obsolete laws? My bet is that you never have to worry about deficits again or redundant statutes. Of course, Congress should already be doing these things, but carrots make both donkeys and elephants move faster. Here's another thought experiment. What if congressmen could only raise money from real people who actually live in their district, not outside interests? That would put a premium on residency and raise the stakes in redistricting, but it would also give local taxpayers more influence. The lesson of these two quick thought experiments is very simple. We need carrots, and they need to be put in the right place. I think taxpayers should position the carrot, not special interests, because we need better people to run for office. We need them to focus on the most important issues, and we need fewer, better laws, not more loopholes. It's ironic in all this that the lessons of market economics are well known outside of Congress, but almost unknown within it. Notice that China, for example, practices state capitalism, but our Congress refuses to use market principles to govern itself. We probably shouldn't be surprised when Congress isn't even true to itself by unwittingly supporting parliamentary behavior. Focusing on what taxpayers are getting for their money is only the start of a real fix for Congress. Congress has long been developing other, more generous funding sources than taxpayers. Political action committees write much bigger checks. Their contribution limits are double. For decades, special interests have helped finance incumbents' campaigns for re-election and committee assignments. Now Citizens United has put those special interests on steroids. Special interests have also been funding second careers and supplemental retirements for incumbent congressmen, since many of them want to become Washington lobbyists once they leave office. The average tenure of a House member is 10 years, just long enough to collect a government pension and to start looking for better work. This revolving door has meant for a long time that Congress has been little more than a farm team for K Street. After Citizens United, it could become a wholly owned subsidiary. Don't expect too much of Congress. I would hate to see you disappointed or disillusioned. Congress will never be more than a sausage factory, but it can be a better sausage factory if we get the incentives right and if good people, more good people, volunteer to serve or at least to help those who do. What if Teach for America channeled its volunteers into campaigns or government service after their teaching was done? What if law schools like this one or other law schools around the country started Lawyers for America to help reform Congress? I personally have never understood why A students wanted to spend a lifetime reading and studying laws written by C students. It should be the other way around. Although Congress will always be flawed, we should never lose faith in America's ability to bounce back from adversity. The fact that we know Congress is broken should give us hope. It's actually a sign that a cure is already underway. The body politic is starting to heal itself. The worse shape we are in, the more likely we are to be proud of our recovery. No one has said this better than Mark Shields when he said recently, quote, "We saw a white Catholic male Republican judge murdered on his way to greet a Democratic Jewish woman member of Congress who was his friend. Her life was saved initially by a 20-year-old Mexican-American gay college student and eventually by a Korean-American combat surgeon. And all this was eulogized by our African-American president. Only in America. Only in America." Thank you.
Okay, so that was extraordinary, and but your work is not finished, Jim.
Okay.
So we're going to have questions. Our convention is that I will identify the question and then the next question as well, so the microphone will be in the right place so the question can start right away. So let me start with Norm here and Aaron.
Ready?
Thank you very much.
Is that on?
Thank you very much. My question is whether you think Citizens United was an intended or an unintended effect of something else. And the reason for the question is corporate America was doing very well for a long period of time. Why take the risks that this kind of political change in control and power might involve rather than letting things go as they were?
I believe that all the justices are good people, and I also know from experience in politics, if you're ever confronted with a situation which you can explain, and it could either be a conspiracy or a screw-up, 99% of the time it's a screw-up. Conspiracies take way too much time and effort to manage and control. So I know conspiracy theories are popular. They're also almost impossible to disprove, but I think this is just a mistake, and a mistake that America should go about correcting.
Aaron.
Thanks for a fantastic speech, Congressman. You spent the first part of it talking about how Congress has become a parliamentary system and sort of decrying that. But political scientists have found the reason non-parliamentary systems are so rare among democracies is because they're very unstable. I can see why they're very beneficial as a member of Congress to be able to have that freedom to vote your conscience and to engage in legislation even as a backbencher. But as an average citizen, it seems much more problematic. You know, the one vote that most people care about the most, the vote for president, they get very invested in, and then the president isn't capable of putting through his legislative platform. It ends up in a bunch of debate through a bunch of individual congressmen and powerful committee chairmen. Can you explain a little bit more about why you think a non-parliamentary system is so valuable?
Excellent question. I know that political scientists are often falling in love with parliaments. But remember, and I should have elaborated this in my remarks, that we essentially have the worst of both worlds because we have parliamentary aspects, but we do not have the accountability of a prime minister who actually has to run the government. So we can blame everybody else forever and not get anything done. I also worry about the polarization of this country, and it's sad to think that a great and mature democracy like ours would actually go backward and embrace something simplistic like a parliament. So I think we are better than this, and it's time for Americans to listen to the better angels of their nature and to enjoy a full-bodied, rich debate, because I think we'll get better outcomes. This three-line whip, this robot voting, to me does not ennoble America.
David.
So, Jim, thank you very much. This was terrific. I'm intrigued with your idea of pay for performance. As somebody, as you know, who spent a lot of my time studying the legal profession, there's actually been a move to pay for performance of the legal profession. There's been a move, as you say, in many other areas. But it's been a complicated move, as you probably know, and many people have argued that actually that move has actually been responsible for swamping some of the other values that we might want lawyers to have. And I guess in the context of Congress, it seems particularly complex because sort of two things. One is, who would decide what the standards of performance are and who would be evaluating? That is, if you were in charge, I'd be happy to put you in charge of evaluating all of us, actually. And then the second thing is, it's a collective product. And so it's always complex to measure the individual performance of a collective product. So kind of on those two things, if you could just say a few more words about that.
Well, Professor Wilkins and I are friends, classmates, and I say, in response to your excellent question, let the debate begin. There are always going to be thousands of reasons not to do something, but we know Congress is broken today. Show me a better way to fix it. And I think the power of the thought experiments, most people in the audience automatically reacted, if we pay people on commission to cut spending, we're going to get spending cut. Certain economic incentives work. I'd be the first to admit that perhaps I'm too much of an economic determinist, but when I read that Keynes had said that we're all slaves of some defunct economist, that rang true with me. Many people are wonderful people who work in bad systems because the carrots are in the wrong place. Sometimes the sticks are in the wrong place. But with smart folks like you, with great universities and think tanks around the country, surely we're smart enough to put the carrots and the sticks in the right place. I think that's a worthy endeavor.
Thank you, Congressman. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you personally navigate the pressure to raise money and the people who are trying to give you money to achieve their own ends.
Well, I'm a terrible fundraiser. My campaign folks will tell you that, because I try to spend most of my time on what I thought I was elected to do: quality legislation, excellent casework back home. But I'm a dying species. When I first came to Congressman, there was a very disciplined and wonderful congressman from Kentucky named Bill Natcher. He looked like a congressman. He had perfect posture. He did the right thing every day. He wrote a journal to his grandkids so they would know what his life had been like. Completely honest, never raised more than $500 for a campaign. He would post a sign in a cafe in Bowling Green, Kentucky when he was up for re-election, and everybody knew Bill's running again. Well, those days are gone, like perhaps my days are gone. Because in the big money machines, money has always been the mother's milk of politics. And when Speaker Pelosi was asked why she should be the Democratic leader after the terrible defeat of 2010, she said, well, I've raised the Democratic Party $280 million. As if that were an answer to the question. To me, money will always have its place. But we've got to focus on other quality measures as well. And right now, those other quality measures are suffering.
Right here.
This was a fascinating talk, as everybody else has said, and we're much indebted to you for it. I have a comment, I think, as much as a question, and the comment has to do with your reliance on markets and market metaphors as the solution to the problem. How would you respond to this alternative vision? That the problem is that markets have spread where they ought not have spread, that there are some things that shouldn't be subject to the forces of the market, and that rather than looking for market solutions, we ought to be looking somehow for some sort of moralized approach that drives markets out of the House of Congress. But the reason that I partly motivated to offer this comment is if we're in the economic determinist mode that you described yourself as being in, then don't we have here what economists would call a collective action problem, such that although it might be in everybody's interest if things change, or it might be in many people's interest if things change, those are people who are likely to be unable to get together coalitions large enough to affect the change. And so if you're in the market model, aren't things worse than you suggest? Isn't this the path of despair rather than hope? And don't we need to look for some other avenue of hope if there is to be one?
Professor Fallon is another friend and classmate, and this is why he's a professor and I'm not. I'm a lowly public servant. I knew from our first meeting, this guy from Maine is really, really smart. Let me put the cookies on a low shelf. To affect any change in politics, you have to use the language that's understood. And right now, market economics, people think they understand it. I'd be the first to agree with you. Sometimes markets have intruded into areas where they never should have gone. But likewise, sometimes we fail to introduce market behavior, and far be it from me to mention market economics to a tenured professor. But there are pockets of things, and I use the basketball analogy. We need a hard-fought game on court, and we need out-of-bounds lines and referees. And the better the referees and the foul lines, the better the game. So it's a combination of market incentives and fierce competitive behavior, animal spirits, and also places you cannot go. So I think this is a debate. Once we visualize the debate, it's kind of like the tools of government problem. Most people I work with do not know how to recognize a screwdriver problem. That's why they use a wrench. So let's help expand the vocabulary so that people can think in new ways. To my knowledge, and I haven't researched the literature, few if any people have suggested this, at least in modern times. We asked the Library of Congress and they had no answer. So we've got to try something new when Congress is this broken. So if you have a better idea, I'm open to it, but let's at least give this a look.
We have a question right here.
Yeah, this is actually building on your last comment. I don't expect you to be a mind reader, but you have known a lot of Congress people since 1994. Of those members, how many of them, if they'd heard you today, would basically privately agree with you? How many of them would vigorously disagree? And given your aside about grade C, how many of them would not even understand the problematic that you outlined?
Well, I value my relationships on the Hill very much, but I've never really tried to be popular. I've never tried to climb the ladder. Partly that's destiny, because if you're a terrible fundraiser like I am, you don't have a chance to climb the ladder. Most people who run for Congress and most people who serve are good people. They're from the heartland. They risk a lot to serve. They endure a lot of bad stuff to do it. Now, there's some perks out there, there's some opportunities, but most are good people. But we will always be a mirror of the American people, a Rorschach test. And you'll find the same number of rascals and snakes in Congress as you do in the general public, because somehow the public elects these folks. We try to cleanse the institution periodically, as Speaker Pelosi said, to drain the swamp, but the swamp keeps on filling up. And that's the glory and the problem of democracy. There was once a senator from Nebraska, Roman Harushka, who said that we need more mediocre justices on the Supreme Court so that the mediocre people of America can be represented. You know, And populism is good because this is government of the people, for the people, and by the people. So I'm hoping this speech is not a career-limiting move. It is pushing the edge of the envelope. Most of my colleagues prefer clubbiness and talking about things like this, if ever, within the family. But sometimes you get tired of waiting for change. And I think a lot of Americans, after the 2008 election, thought more change would be happening. And the president essentially faced a honeymoon problem. He gets elected as president, and we way over-personalize that job. He's not omnipotent. He doesn't get a halo or a magic wand with the job. But then he has to work with two key people, Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi, both of whom are fine people. But the question is, do you pick a fight on your honeymoon? And he chose not to do that, as all wise husbands do. It doesn't matter what the reason is, do not pick a fight on your honeymoon. But now the honeymoon is over. I think he needs to tangle with Congress a lot more and make us behave. That would help the institution and help the country.
Thank you, Mr. Congressman, for a stimulating presentation. I'm a political scientist that's not in love with parliamentary systems. I prefer the Congress of Sam Rayburn and Lyndon Johnson, or Tip O'Neill and Howard Baker. But I'm struck by the fact that you're giving this presentation in 2011. If you had given it exactly 100 years ago, in 1911, it would have had some similar tones. You would have been railing against an overly powerful speaker, Joseph Cannon, and there was a revolt in that very year against him. On the other hand, if you had given this presentation 50 years ago, in 1961, you would have been on the side of Sam Rayburn, who prevailed by a 217 to 212 vote to expand the overly powerful House Rules Committee. And that seems to bracket the extremes, a powerful speaker, powerful decentralized committees. We seem never to get it quite right, and I wonder how one squares that circle. How do you balance these two extreme forms of legislative organization?
Well, thank you for your question. I know it's frustrating for professors that we never quite get it right, but I actually think this is a saving grace of democracy. Our government is a whole lot like an antique grandfather clock. It's 200 plus years old. There's a giant pendulum at the bottom that swings back and forth that does two things. It not only provides energy, it also gives us something to watch. Democracy is a spectator sport, and we want the people to be involved, and it's boring. Nobody will pay attention. Congress today is almost becoming really a channel on reality TV, because congressmen are cheaper to hire, we're easier to make fun of, and you get to vote us off the island every 2 years, all at taxpayer expense. So there's a messiness in democracy. This is what I refer to as taking the Bismarck line about the sausage factory. There are two things you never want to see being made, laws and sausages. That messiness is hard sometimes for a clean, rational academic to appreciate, but it's also part of the system, and it's worked better than any other system. So I celebrate it, and you're exactly right about the pendulum swings in history. I don't know how I would have voted 50 or 100 years ago. I was just trying to make it work better today.
Christine.
I was hoping you could say a couple words about healthcare reform. I'm a medical student and am fairly concerned that my profession is going to be the anchor that drags down the U.S. economy. And it seems like in the current healthcare debate discourse that people are just saying, you can have everything, you don't have to give up anything, it won't cost you a penny. But clearly, every player is going to have to give up something. So how, because it's such an immediate debate, is there any way we can make that better?
Thank you for asking about healthcare reform. I've devoted more of my legislative time for that than any other issue by far. But there's someone sitting in this audience who is truly a national treasure. I'm lucky because he worked for me for a short while, but he's transcended anything I could ever do. It's Atul Gawande is here. Read his essay in last week's New Yorker. Again, it is awesome. The piece on hot spotters, his piece on the cost conundrum, literally shaped and maybe transformed the health debate, because he can put complex things in simple terms and help both regular folks and the ultra-sophisticated understand what's really going on. This is the subject not only of a lecture on its own. I teach a semester-long course on this at Vanderbilt, but medical students need to learn about the system. You have a terrific regional expert, John Wenberg, Dr. Jack Wenberg at Dartmouth. His current book, Tracking Medicine, is amazing. It's transformative. Read it, take it to heart. There are really exciting things going on in medicine. There's no reason to be discouraged. This is basically the best time since the Flexner Report, and it's really a great time to embrace not only individual care, but population medicine. We can and will make the system work better.
I want to press you a little on how realistically you can think of pressing a campaign to accomplish some of what you're trying to accomplish. So it seems to me part of what makes your remarks so powerful is that you are in Congress and you're speaking from knowledge about what it used to be like, what it is like now. And I a little despair at when you sort of talk about how universities or the think tanks could provide answers, and wonder how much you're working, and there was one question a little like this, but how much are you working to try to create coalitions within Congress? Because it must be that there are a lot of people who feel the frustration that I would at least hope it's true, that there are a lot of people who feel some of the frustrations you do about not being able to do the kind of work that you went to Congress to do.
Professor Bartholet is a friend, and I wish she'd been a classmate. I've learned a lot from her on family law issues, foster care and adoption, which is perhaps the most neglected and broken part of all of federal law, but she's trying to fix it. The key in American politics is you have to be optimistic. Things are never as bad as they seem. Reagan's sunny optimism after the Carter years, the alleged malaise, although he never mentioned that in the speech, was something that Americans appreciated, because you can't build morale without being positive. Now, there are daunting obstacles. I'd be the first to admit that. But there are ways to help people understand. Now, we have elections, and they should be competency tests. They should be rewards or punishments for good or bad behavior. But right now, the public is not given the tools to understand who's a good legislator or not. I'm a Blue Dog Democrat. We're fiscally conservative. It's difficult for us to show concretely exactly which votes were good or bad for America. So voters are clueless, and you can spin it either way. And in fact, we've gotten so good at spin that we've almost departed from facts entirely. You know, Fox and MSNBC can not even cover the same events that day. So you're almost wondering if they're reporting on two different nations, red or blue America, and never the twain shall meet. So somehow we have to get beyond this. The recent Financial Reform Commission was unable to agree on the facts of the fiscal crisis. You know, that is stunning. So somehow it reminds me of the Yeats poem, "The Center Cannot Hold." You know, we've got to really be careful here, because he was overly pessimistic in the 20s, maybe not about Ireland, but about the world. But you know, when the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity, that is a scary situation. So there are opportunities here to build, and I think the key is to be able to persuade the average Rotarian back home. Because in my opinion, Civic Club folks are the backbone of America, and I think Robert Putnam would back me up on that. You can reach these folks because there's a balance wheel somewhere in this magnificent grandfather clock that's always worked. And it's going to work again if we let it. There are powerful outside forces, the media and other things, that are pulling it in different directions. But I think it's about to work. So people should not be discouraged.
Right
here.
Thank you very much, Congressman. I thought that your comments were very poignant. But what you didn't address, or you addressed that the Congress is broken, but no one puts forth drastic solutions. The old kitchen table, what Obama said the average family is sitting around and discussing. The issue is revenues and expenditures. The government is like running a business. So where are specifics that someone will stand up and say, I will throw my career to the wind, but we've got to raise revenue, and there are other ways of raising it. A value-added tax, don't call it a tax, a luxury fee for somebody that buys a $100,000 car, $500 pair of shoes, things along those lines. Where does somebody stand up and say, enough with tenure or certain levels of poor quality education. We're at the bottom of the pit. How do we climb out of that well? Where does a congressman or a senator stand up and say A, B, C, and D, and literally either get the money, since corporations or there are some good people who will fund that, go on television and say, here are the solutions. It's painful, you're in the ICU or very close to it. Where is that?
Mm-hmm. Well, the limiting factor on an open discussion of ideas in American politics is the fear of the 30-second attack ad. Somebody can take something entirely out of context and you'll look like a jerk when they didn't hear or didn't want to hear the entire speech. There are excellent examples of things we could and should be doing. The President's Fiscal Commission did an outstanding report. We cannot allow that to gather dust. It's spending cuts, it's tax increases, it's a sensible bipartisan compromise. It got 11 votes, it needed 14. Both House and Democrats and Republicans torpedoed the report because either the Democrats or the Republicans voting for it could have forced a congressional vote. Yes or no, up or down on that, and on a congressional alternative, kind of like the King of the Hill rule I was mentioning that we haven't had in a decade. So progress is being made, but we need to be informed enough to know about these reports and how valuable they are. We have a terrible problem when we're not even measuring the problem. And that was my first point tonight. And I know accounting is boring. I hated taking accounting for lawyers here at the law school, but it's necessary. If you can't measure it, you cannot manage it. And we are refusing to measure it. The corollary is if you won't measure it, then perhaps you don't deserve to manage it. And I'd say that's the position that Congress is in right now. Without an accurate measure, we don't have the urgency that would come from understanding the true dimensions of our problems. And when the Wall Street Journal and No Interest Group will help us, congressmen are handicapped because they're used to relying on outside support for their backbones. We need stronger backbones. And perhaps folks like you can help us with that.
So let me take the advantage of being the chair to ask a question. I understand your profession requires you to be optimistic. Mine doesn't. So I'd just like to put together the kind of incentives you've described here and see how you can see optimism in it. There are two dimensions we could talk about. One is the incentives that members face. You repeated my favorite line of yours about Congress becoming a farm team for K Street. And why are they a farm team for K Street? Well, you have many people going into Congress who are making less than graduates of this law school make in their first year when they go to work on Wall Street, assuming they can get jobs, which is not any longer an assumption you can make. But I mean, if they did, they would have that kind of income. So they have an income stream, which many of them, because of their talents or their family or just choose they can't live. So they assume they're going to be moving into a place where they'll exercise their influence in a way that makes the problem you've described much worse. So that's, you've talked about some ways of thinking about tinkering with incentives on congressmen. So are you talking about congressmen's pay as a way to resolve that? And on the other side, you know, let me put together some elements that you've described and see if you think they fit like this. Congress is eager to minimize the number of toss-up seats or increase the number of safe seats. Safe seats make it easier for people to talk to the extremes. Talking to the extremes makes it easier to raise money, because if you really want to raise money, it's best to be talking loudly and sharply to the base, and the base is increasingly at the extremes. That means the whole rhetoric of the active politician becomes more polarized as a way of raising money, as a way to facilitate the raising of money. So the raising of money here inside the campaigns drives the discourse, can be driving the discourse towards these extremes, which makes it harder to have members like yourself who are trying to figure out the moderate middle. Now, for that solution too, you know, what is the real solution to that? That's not Congress pay. That might be some version of public funding or something like that, but I assume you think public funding in that form is, given the House just voted yesterday to eliminate it for the presidency, completely off the table.
Well, first, Larry, I appreciate your devoting so much of your professional career to trying to reform our democratic institutions. I think that's vitally important work, and I'm grateful to you for that. This is a curious subject because smart people have difficulty grappling with it. I think Einstein was supposed to have said, look, physics is easy, politics is hard. There's something that's awkward about this whole thing. And right now, you're right, politically it's impossible to suggest things like public financing, having just had a huge Republican tide. But there are surely better ways to do this, and I am suggesting that we change congressional pay. You have to have a direct incentive. I don't necessarily think we need a net pay increase at all. I'm not advocating a pay raise for all of Congress. But today, the only differentiation in pay is the Speaker gets paid a little bit more, maybe the majority or minority leaders, but everybody else is paid the same. A senator who represents California makes the same money that I do representing 700,000 people in Middle Tennessee. This is an unusual system. So how do you create incentives for better behavior? I think there have got to be some obvious benchmarks for doing it. The few times this has been suggested in the past, they pay if you show up. If you miss votes, they dock your pay. Well, that's a little simplistic. You know, there's got to be a way, and maybe some groups can help us with this. Who really is fiscally responsible in this country, regardless of spin? But see, there you're going to have to change the way Congress packages votes because we'll put things in a giant sausage roll and you can't sort out exactly which element is what. So discrete voting may be actually an important byproduct of this discussion. So we separate issues so you know with clarity what members are voting on, what they support or don't support. That would terrify members. That might be more hostilely received than pay differences because it's easy to hide in Congress. We're largely anonymous. And actually, to me, there's a point here that's worth noting. The Senate was supposed to be the group of statesmen, but now, with more secure House seats, if anyone is still left in America that's statesman-like, it could be House members. Because senators are guaranteed a multi-million-dollar opponent every 6 years. They have to raise $20,000 or $30,000 a week their entire 6-year term. They cannot take a year off to legislate. They've got to be raising money like crazy. House members, on the other hand, the multimillionaires in America don't seek our jobs. There's not enough ego gratification in what we do, so we're relatively protected. Some other key insights, since this is an academic group, hopefully you won't punish me, but I think these are fundamental in understanding the system. Henry Adams had it right almost 100 years ago when he said the purpose of a political party is the systematic organization of hatreds. Fear and anger motivate people, sadly, more than other higher motives. And y'all are the same way. How do we overcome that? Another key insight is from G.K. Chesterton, 80 years ago, he said that the purpose of the Liberal Party is to keep on making mistakes. The purpose of the Conservative Party is to refuse to correct those mistakes. And I think that does more to capture the dueling negativism that we have in American politics than anything else I have ever seen. And somehow by understanding the machine, the mechanism, we can improve its workings. And I'm optimistic not just because I've got to be, but because everybody, no matter how deeply cynical or angry they are about America, acknowledges this one simple, overwhelming fact. We live in the greatest nation on earth. We live in the greatest nation in the history of the world. Our job is to keep it that way. We can do that.
We had one more question here. You have a microphone? Just one. I'm sorry, one second, sir. We just get a microphone to you. There we go.
I'm Attorney Benedict Fitzgerald. President Truman appointed me chief counsel of the committee to investigate lobbying activities. And we prepared 10 volumes of our investigations, which are available in the library. And since then, there have been 40,000 registered lobbyists admitted in Washington, which many of them prepare the legislation that's being drafted, and they present it to the congressman. Do you have any comments as to what improvements should be made to the series of lobbying acts that were made following further investigations?
Well, Mr. Fitzgerald, I appreciate your pioneering work on this issue. It's remarkable that there was a recognized problem even back then during the Truman administration, because today we view that as kind of an innocent age. It's curious today in America, we essentially have a system of dual representation. There are now 33 lobbyists in Washington for every elected official. Some estimates take it as high as 60. And one group, the electeds, are paid for by taxpayers. The other group is paid for by largely voluntary contributions from corporations. It might be your hobby, your lifestyle, your church, your charity. And it's amazing that people so distrust us that they're willing to pay twice to get the same job done. I tell people all the time, you're already paying my salary. I'm a hired hand. I work for you. You know, you don't even have to come to Washington because I come back home every weekend to see you. But see, they want to come to Washington because, you know, they get a little break and get a nice meal and stay in a hotel room. So this is a curious system that's grown up over the years, and there must be a felt need for this, perhaps economic, perhaps cultural. So it's kind of keeping tabs on us. But the voluntary sector, you know, sometimes called lobbyists, is a curious thing. I fight with them all the time. I'm not one of their popular folks because if anyone likes an uninformed member, it's a lobbyist, because then they're a blank slate they can write on. Folks like me who know the history or ask questions are immensely troublesome. So I think if we had more informed members, that might curb a little bit the public's need to feed this dual system, and also the lobbyist's success in achieving what they want. Because this theory that they're equal dueling interests and it really doesn't matter where the money goes is wrong. You know, on a few issues, it's perfectly equal and balanced, but usually the money side, in my opinion, is not in the public interest. So we have to rely on the goodwill of folks to overcome the money by doing the right thing for the country.
Charles Fried was on a panel for the ABA that was reviewing lobbying practices following on the same question. And one of the recommendations made by that panel was that lobbyists give up the practice of raising money for members of Congress, or at least raising money in areas where they're lobbying. Do you think that would be a significant change in the game?
Well, it's an interesting idea. I hadn't heard it yet. Money is so tricky. There's so many subterranean pathways. You know, it's fungible. It's I don't know how you would monitor or much less police that. It's a little bit like the Citizens United distinction. How do you know when you're currying favor with a Citizens United donor? It could be anybody. But if you give a speech to their board of directors or to a corporate retreat or to their convention of their employees, you're likely to be on their favored list. If you're never invited, you're likely to be on their unfavored list. And you kind of wonder who's doing the thinking for the corporation. Is it an EVP of policy planning who really knows the issue? Or are they just getting a memo from the Chamber of Commerce that tells them Republicans are good and all Democrats are bad? You know, we face this problem all the time as a blue dog Democrat because we're kind of between the two political parties. We're essentially without a home. And that makes it terribly awkward for us. And it's a very dangerous place to be in politics because, as the old Texas Agriculture Commission or Jim Hightower once said, there are only two things you see in the middle of the road: yellow lines and dead armadillos. And in my area, it's more dead possums. But still, it's a hazardous place to be because if you're an extremist, as Larry was talking about earlier, you only have one flank to protect. We have both flanks to protect. And that makes our races twice as expensive and harder for people to understand because there's an inherent human desire to simplify, to pigeonhole. And I ask everybody, update your stereotypes every once in a while. Try to understand the issue. And everything has been dumbed down in this generation. It's hard for you to see. Time magazine and Newsweek did not used to be like People. People wasn't invented yet. Even CQ and National Journal, the most erudite of congressional publications that cost thousands of dollars a year to subscribe to, have been dumbed down. So in the information age, we actually are facing an information shortage because we're discovering that more and more people really don't want information because that's painful. We want to reinforce our own prejudices, and that's comfortable. And that makes today's environment particularly tricky.
I have a question about political rhetoric and political language. And part of the backdrop is that I was very struck listening to the State of the Union speech several days ago by how nationalist it was. I mean, that's partly built into the occasion, but I think there's something more than that going on. And I noted in your comments and in something that you said in response to a question, the insistence on American exceptionalism. You know, your final comments, only in America, which was very moving. I'm not quite sure how true it is. The president of France is the son of Hungarian immigrants. The head of the Labour Party in Britain is the son of a well-known Belgian Marxist immigrant. I don't think that would happen quite here. And, you know, but the question is, I mean, is it necessary in American political life at this point to keep insisting that we are the greatest nation on earth? To keep insisting on our exceptionalism? It seems to me there are real hazards in doing so. And there may be some real advantages on pointing out our commonalities with people in other countries and the commonalities of the problems that we face.
Well, on this issue, we're just going to have to disagree. The average American really doesn't want to travel abroad for vacation, doesn't want to learn a foreign language, and really doesn't care a whole lot about the rest of the world. Now, perhaps they should be faulted for that, but that's the way they feel. I'm fairly international. I try to focus on these issues. I know a few languages. I try to do a little better than that, but it's a challenge. Remember when the House of Representatives renamed French fries freedom fries? You know, I like to point out to them that there are only two portraits in the House chamber. One is George Washington, that's obvious. Who's the other one? No one has any idea who it is. It's the Marquis de Lafayette, because he helped finance the revolution. It's convenient to forget that. I worry that Americans with ADHD can't even remember 10 years ago, much less 200 years ago. So we have multiple challenges here, but in general, we are the only superpower. That's undisputed. I think it's a good thing. I think America has done more to promote good in the world than any other nation. That's not to say we're perfect. We have made many, many mistakes. My brother just pointed out a book to me called The Last Cruise, which substantially erodes Teddy Roosevelt's reputation, his terrible injustices in the Philippines. So we need to keep on learning our history and looking at the dark corners of it as well as the bright, shining cities on a hill. So every country is going to be proud of itself. We're not talking about we don't want empire, we don't want to take over that. Now we have vast cultural and economic influence around the world, but we're essentially the most altruistic power that's ever been, that had any power. I think that's a good thing. It should be celebrated. It should be appreciated. And I think there's far more good than bad. And when I look at the glass, it's half full. It's not half empty.
Another question back here.
I was wondering what advice you would give to a law student considering a career as congressional staffer, both with regards to their own career and how to assist their boss.
Apply for a job in my office. And if we don't have something, we'll help find you something, because we need to attract good talent to the Hill. And young people run our government. That's one of the fabulous things. It's the most upwardly mobile thing you can possibly do. I knew George Stephanopoulos when he was just wet behind the ears, and he's had an amazing career. Rahm Emanuel, they're amazing folks who have excelled because this is a non-hierarchical profession. And if you show talent and ability, especially if you can write, if you can think, my God, you're precious. So please don't be discouraged. It's not the coolest thing to apply for a job on the Hill or an agency, but we actually need folks there too. And too many people have vilified public service. We've got to bring back its reputation. Paul Volcker, a literal and figurative giant in our time, this is one of his biggest issues. And we need to listen to Paul when he talks about these things.
So we'll take one more question from Jonathan.
So I understand, obviously, that there are major differences between the political system in the US and other countries. I also understand why it's often not palatable to talk publicly about what we may learn from other countries. But are you having conversations with legislators, with colleagues in other nations about doing things that might be helpful in this system, whether it be broadly acculturating notions of public service or more practical, pragmatic ground-level solutions?
Mm-hmm. I appreciate your interest in international comparisons, and certainly we can learn from them. But to be honest with you, this is something that our academic friends are going to have to help us with. Having worked a lot in healthcare, the only helpful book in healthcare, I apologize if you're one of the authors of one of the other books, the only helpful book on international comparisons in healthcare that I've seen is T.R. Reid's book called The Healing of America. Because there he did, keep it simple, He had a bum shoulder. He took it to 10 different countries. Who did the best job? And it's a real life description that you can understand, and it makes a difference. It helps people understand that, guess what? If you think you hate the British system, we already have it in the VA. If you think you hate the Canadian system, we already have it. It's called Medicare. If you think you hate, you go down the line, the German system, we already have it on our employer-sponsored health insurance system. And if you really admire the Indian system, cash pay, we got that too. Only we don't want to talk about that part. So it's amazing. There are underlying similarities once you open your mind up to think, but this is hazardous territory. A lot of folks say, I want a vacation in Florida. I don't want to go to France. You know, that's the mindset, because the French people aren't very nice when you go over there, and there are a bunch of drafty old buildings. And Florida, we can deal, you know. And see, this is America. And as we expand the franchise, as we've expanded the franchise, we have to understand who the bosses are. And the American people are the bosses.
And I'm the boss of this event
Okay.
as an American person. Thank you very much.
Larry.